Good afternoon. Today's lecture, or today's video is a little bit different. It's called Capa Negra, or sometimes Los Negritos. They represent black slaves. And the interesting thing about that is that in this particular area, the highlands of Peru, near Cusco, there were never any black slaves. But these groups are in many, many towns. There will be a similar group, same dances, same music in other towns. And I've seen Capa Negra in probably 2 or 3 other places, and they're around. I always like to think about them as the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or some sort of religious group, some group that has some affiliation, and they have affiliation with other groups of the same name doing the same dances in their towns elsewhere. Today's lecture is a little bit different. Peru's King Tut, the royal tomb of Sipan, and I'm going to do a lot of background before we get to the archaeological site that I'm talking about. Can we turn down the lights that are on the screen there? Are we ready? Okay. So, we're going to go to the north coast of Peru, and if you're not familiar with where we are, actually we're not there yet. We're down about right in here right now, but we're going to go to the region called the North Coast region. It's 200 or 400 miles north of Lima, and it's around, the area that I'm talking about is around the city of Trujillo. That is a scheduled stop for the next cruise. We will see whether we go there or not. But I showed you this chart before. We've had the Nazca culture from the early intermediate period, and we've had the Incas from the late Horizon. This time we're going to talk about the Moche culture on the north coast, which is a typical early intermediate culture. So they were the dominant people on the north coast beginning around the time of Christ. They began to expand away from the area where they started around 300 AD, and they were the dominant culture up through about 700 or 800 AD. They started near the city of Trujillo, in the valley of the city of Trujillo, and the next valley to the north, the next valley south, and again, their expansion was around 300 AD. Much of what we know about them comes from their pottery. And I gave you these 3 words in the Nazca lecture, but if you missed that, Waka is a sacred spot, perhaps a pyramid, a mountaintop, a cemetery, some sacred spot. Wako is a ceramic pot, usually a high-status ceramic pot that might be buried with somebody in a cemetery or used on a pyramid or some sort of ceremonial center. And Wakero is grave robbers that loot Wakos from Wakas. Okay, so 3 words. This fella is important for our story. Rafael Larco Oile was the son of Italian immigrants. His parents came to Peru in the middle 1880s, and by the time he was born, they had a very, very large, very rich sugar hacienda in the north coast, a little to the north of Trujillo, in the Chicama Valley, where I did much of my research. He died actually the same year that I got to Peru, 1966, for the first time. As a young man, his parents sent him to Cornell University to get a degree in ag engineering. They wanted him to take over their sugar plantation. He never did graduate from Cornell. He was somewhat of a playboy, but he also spent his summers when he was at Cornell traveling throughout the United States. He spent a lot of time in the American Southwest looking at archaeological sites. He's very much interested in archaeology. And when he was back in Peru, he did a lot of archaeology. He wrote, I think, 12 books on Peruvian archaeology. There he is a little bit later, close to the time he died. And here he is when he was working out in the field, studying archaeology right around his family's hacienda. The material that he collected, and also some came from his father. His father had collected stuff. They bought things from Waqueros. They bought other people's collections. Ultimately, before he died, was transferred from the hacienda, because there was a small museum on the hacienda, down to Lima. and it's now called the Larco Museum. The full name of the museum is his father's name, so he named it after his father. But it's my favorite museum in Lima. It has a wonderful display of archaeological materials. It's very easy. It's well done, up to modern museum standards. But the thing that's different about the Larco Museum compared to most museums around the world is that you can go into the storerooms. And these photos here are in the storerooms. And it has just rack after rack after rack of huacos, many of which Larco himself excavated, or his men excavated, or that they bought from huaqueros from the area. And archaeologists have studied this, suggest that there are something on the order of about 100,000 Moche period huacos in museums and private collections around the world. So something on the order of 100,000. This museum has about 40,000. So 40% of the known corpus is in this one museum. And they're just racks after racks after racks. And I say it's unusual that you can actually go into the storerooms very, very easily without any problems at all. One of the things that Larco did is to serrate, or to put into a chronological order, Moche pottery. And they're usually referred to as from Moche 1 to Moche 5. Moche 1 on the left, Moche 5 to the right. And a lot of the serration comes from the spouts of the pieces. They have what's called a stirrup spout, a kind of a U-shaped handle, and then a single spout coming off of that U shape. Moche 1 are typically fairly squat, the upper part of the spout. Moche 3 and 4 are tall and straight up and down. By Moche 5 times, the spout is kind of wider at the base and narrower at the top. So wider here where it joins the stirrup, and narrow at the top. So this would be a Moche 1 or Moche 2 pot. It has a squat little spout on the top there. Again, this typical stirrup spout, Moche. This is also probably a Moche 1 or 2. And this would be a Moche 4. Notice that in some cases the globular part of the pot, the bottom part of the pot, is painted. Moche did a lot of different designs on those pots. Sometimes, though, the body of the pot is figurative, like this. This is a little duck of some sort, probably a Muscovy duck. Not really a duck, though. If you notice, he's carrying a club and a shield. Most ducks do not carry clubs and shields in their hands. Here's a very nice one of a seabird. And there, a deer. But again, this deer has hands. Most deer don't have hands. And here, this is clearly a human wearing a deer headdress. If you see the body, hands, and the position of the feet and so forth, that's clearly a human seated but wearing a deer headdress. Or here, a little guy. There, a warrior figure. This is a high-status person, a fairly high-status person. Not only is he a warrior with a club and a shield, but he has ear spools. That's an indicator of high status. And he's also wearing a fairly fancy headdress. So this would be a much higher status person, again with a club, big ear spools, fancy headdress, also an arret, a nose ornament. And this is a pretty high status person with ear spools, headdress. He's seated on a throne with his pet jaguar, which would have had to come from the eastern lowlands, brought over from the Amazon area. Now, the Moche are famous for two different kinds of pots. One are erotic pots. If any of you go to the Larco Museum, they have two rooms set aside that are kind of adults-only rooms with their erotic collection. They have the biggest collection of erotic pots. I actually have a number of different lectures that I can use on the ships, and one of them that I do for the Archaeological Institute of America is called Sex and Human Sacrifice in the Moche Culture. Cruise directors don't like that one. It is an adults-only lecture. But the other pot, the other type of pot, moche pot, that is very famous and actually on the art market is very, very expensive, are these portrait pots. And these are actually life portraits of someone. We can tell that by things like facial decoration, tattoos, face painting, and so forth. And some individuals have been seen in pots when they were young and kind of middle-aged, and then again as an older person, again based on facial deformities and tattoos. Many of these are mold-made, so there are duplicates. 6 or 8 of the same pot are found in various museums. These are 2 identical ones from the Larco. But absolutely wonderful pieces. This is not only do we see it as a moche 4 because of the spout, but this particular decoration there of the snake is typical of moche 4. In one of the sites that I excavated was a moche site, and we found just very small pieces of pottery, but it had that serpent on it, and we knew it was a moche 4 site. Absolutely wonderful pieces. Here are 2 that are identical, except for a little bit of the painting, and again, they're actually from different museums. Clearly the same pot. The person who's done more about moche than anyone else is a fellow by the name of Christopher Donnan. And he's written a bunch of books. This one focused only on the portraits, and he made the argument that you can find the same individual on different of the portrait pots. The ones there. There's a picture of Chris. Let me tell you a little bit of my story with Chris. I went to UCLA in the fall of 1967, and the first quarter I was there, I took a course on Peruvian archaeology from a woman by the name of Karen Bruns. Karen later taught at San Francisco State, and we've been friends ever since. In the spring of '68, same academic year, I took the same course again with a different professor, Mike West, who later taught at the University of Virginia. I couldn't take it for credit, but I got it as an audit listed on my transcript. Chris came to UCLA for the first time in the spring of '69, just before I was to head to Peru to do my doctoral work. I could not take it for credit or audit. I couldn't even get it to be on my record, but I sat in on his course. And from the spring of '69, we've been good friends ever since. There's a more recent picture of Chris. Among the things that Chris did over the years, and for more than 20-some years, he photographed all the moche pots that he could find. He went to museums all over the world, private collectors. He would go to their houses, photograph pots. He developed a corpus of moche pots. He had thousands of pictures of them and information about them. Here's one that where the bottom of the vessel has a lot of painting on it, what we call a fine line painting. It's almost so Baroque that you can't see what's there. It's a late pot. It's a moche 5 pot, wider base than the top of the spout, typical moche 5. And here's one that's a moche 4, and what you see there is a fisherman. But unfortunately, we can't see the entire pot. It's sort of like looking at a globe and seeing only one hemisphere. So what we really need to do if we're looking at moche pots is to see a fine line drawing like this of that same pot. And what the entire thing is telling us, that we've got a fisherman who has caught some sort of a big mythological fish. Chris Donnan talks about this as a theme. And he identified over 100 themes in moche art that are telling a story. The way in which I like to talk about this is to get you to think about a Christmas card. Okay, think about a Christmas card. Suppose in late November or early December, you get an envelope in the mail, you open it up, and you look at it, and it's got 3 guys on camels. You don't think to yourself, oh, this is a late Halloween card. If you are of the Christian persuasion, you know that's how that image of 3 guys on camels fits into a particular story. The same way if you opened up the envelope and it had a manger scene or some guys, some shepherds out in the field. You know the story of the Nativity, and you can put that particular image into the story immediately. You know it right away. Our problem is we are seeing scenes, but we don't know the story. Okay? Here's one where it's a house up there on the top, but around the bottom there's images, these fine line drawing. And it's of a couple of houses, and it's got a bunch of guys doing something. But how does that fit into a story? Here's one. It's a fairly common one. There are lots of pots with this story. It's warriors fighting, and there's a bunch of them there in various poses. Sometimes you'll find a pot that just has two guys fighting. Sometimes you'll just see the background. They're out in the desert. These are mountains, and there's some plants that represent the desert. Sometimes you only see the mountains in an image, but you know right away it's that story of the fighting out in the desert. The upper one there is what we refer to as the burial scene. And it's got a coffin being lowered down into a grave, and it's got a number of other guys, particular images, particular people there. The drawing there is done by the late Donna McClellan, who was a graduate student at UCLA when I was there. Here's one that is referred to as the presentation scene. It's got some guys giving something to a high-status individual who's seated in a little house. And again, we know he's high status by his ear spool and his headdress. Here's another version of the presentation. This time, we've got two different levels or registers. The lower register has a bunch of different things going on. This is a litter that a high-status person might be carried in. Over here on the bottom right is a collection of arms, weapons, shields, and things like that. And there's also a couple of guys who are having their throats split. Remember my story of sex and human sacrifice. We won't get into it. But there's also there on the upper level 4 main characters. Let's call the first guy, the guy on the left there, individual A. And then there's B. And B is handing a cup to individual A. And then there's C and D. I might just point out that C is smaller than the others. She's a female, and she has a particular distinctive headdress that she always wears. But so we've got A, B, C, and D. Here's a colored version of it. We actually have a pretty good idea of what colors they would have been. Not that they've been on pots, because most moche pots only have 2 colors, but these also appear on murals. And there's our cup again. This is a reconstruction off of a mural from a site in the Peña Valley in the North Coast, and that's individual C, and notice that she is holding the cup, and she has this headdress, this kind of strange headdress, but she has the cup in her hand. Okay, so let's go to a site called Sipan. It's in the Lambayeque Oasis, north of Trujillo, near the city of Chiclayo. And beginning in 1987, there were some excavations here. And in those excavations, the first thing that they found was individual A. So this is the North Coast. I've done a lot of work in the Chicama Valley. I've lived there a lot. And we're going to go a little bit farther north. This is the Lambayeque area here. And Sipan is right there. The modern city of Chiclayo is there in the middle of that valley. So there's the Lambayeque Oasis, there's Sipan. And here's a little bit closer view. The site is there, or a closer view there. It consists of 3 pyramids. One fairly small one, it's actually covered by these buildings over there, and then a medium-sized one and a bigger one. Probably the bigger one dates to a slightly later culture. At Moche times, it was the smaller one here and this mid-sized one that were the main pyramids at the site. So, smaller one over here, middle is a mid-sized one, and on the left is a big one from a little bit later time period. This is a photo I took out of the window of a plane flying over. This area here is a smaller pyramid than a mid-sized one, and the big one there in the background. And there's my picture of this smaller one. This is where our story starts. It starts in February of 1987. The local archaeologist was a guy named Walter Alva, and I had been friends with Walter from the mid-'70s when I ran a project in Peru. A local guy, and he was the director of the local archaeological museum. And one day in February of '87, the local police invited him, actually asked him to come to the police station. He was sick in bed, but they said it was so important that he had to get out of bed, come to the police station, because there was a problem. A guy who was a huaquero, a grave robber, was at the police station complaining and asking for police help because he had gotten basically screwed by his buddies, the other huaqueros. They had found a tomb, and all he got was peanuts. We laugh at that because when we say in English that somebody only got peanuts, that means they didn't get very much. All he got was a couple of peanuts, like that. The ones on the right are uncleaned, and the ones on the left are clean. These are gold peanuts, and they're about 3 or 4 inches long. And all he got was a couple of peanuts. And he was complaining. Well, Walter looked at this and realized this is probably a pretty significant burial that they've excavated. He got the police to find out from the guy where the burial was, where the site was, and they went out the next day with a lot of police. They kicked the huaqueros out. The place was swarming with huaqueros, and put it under police guard. The story is that something like 5 or 6 pickup trucks of gold had been taken out of a looted tomb. There's the peanuts again. And all the stuff I'm going to show you here are stuff from the looted tomb. Chris Donnan tracked down much of it on the international art market, and some of it ended up going back to Peru. The FBI was involved on some of this, and people in Europe. But this is a reconstruction. It's not the original one, but it's the original peanuts, but they've reconstructed as a necklace with peanuts. There's Walter. Again, I've been friends with him for a long, long, long time. Incidentally, last Saturday, he was honored at a meeting in the city of Los Angeles, California. They had a whole program in honor of him last Saturday in Los Angeles. Picture on the right is from National Geographic. He is in the looted tomb, and he's holding something that the huaqueros, the looters, had not yet found. So it's a very deep tomb. You see the ladder in the background. Here's my photograph of that same ladder a little bit later, same year. All of this here is stuff that came out of the looted tomb. That's a mask about 8 inches in diameter, gold. This is a rattle. Those balls around the side are hollow. They have a little stone inside. They make a noise. The figure in the middle is what we refer to as the decapitator god, Ayapec. And in one hand, his left hand, over here on the right side, he's holding a bronze knife. And in his right hand, he is holding a trophy head that he has cut off. Remember our trophy heads from the Nazca culture. The thing here is about 9 inches wide. The figure in the center there is about 4 or 5 inches high. And there's a close-up on, look at the detail, the stones that have been placed in his mouth and his eyes. Again, the head is only about 1 inch wide. There's a little figure here of lapis lazuli. Lapis comes from Chile, about 1,500 miles away. This is one of the pots that came out of the looted tomb. And again, the looted tomb was right there. Or here in this National Geographic view, the looted tomb was underneath the stairways going up onto the smaller of the pyramids. Right away, Walter began an excavation. He had virtually no money. Chris Donnan was there working on another project, but Chris gave him some money, gave him all the film that he had, said this is something real important, and immediately they got National Geographic money to help out here. Now, the photos that I'm going to show you as we come along here are going to be of 3 types. Ones that don't have an attribution are mine. I was at the site many times over the next couple of years, so if they don't have anybody's name on it, they're mine. Otherwise, some of the photos are going to be ones that Chris Donnan gave me. We traded images, ones that I took that he didn't have, I gave to him, and we traded. And some of these are going to be National Geographic photos. Here, they had started an excavation on the top part of the pyramid, and these guys are going to pull off a cloth that they had covering something, and it was a burial. It was up near the top of the pyramid, and it was a young adult male, probably a warrior. He had a shield. You can actually see the green here. It was a copper shield. It had totally eroded away, but you can still see a little bit of the green from the copper. And then as they continued to excavate down, they found other things. They ultimately got down to a single tomb, a single coffin. It was actually a wooden coffin here. It's the only wooden coffin that has ever been found in Peru. And around that coffin, here's a reconstruction. The wooden coffin in the center. To the left and the right were individuals, males, high status based on things like ear spools and headdresses and stuff. At his head, there was a single female. At his foot, there were two females. The interesting thing about the females specifically is that they had been long dead before they were put into this tomb. They were in cane coffins, and the bones were completely jumbled up, particularly the two that were at the foot. And the explanation was that the cane coffin was tilted as they brought it in and put it into this tomb, and the bodies had been totally removed from flesh. They were totally desiccated and just skeletons, and as they put them in there, they got all jumbled up together. There was a young child up above, and there was lots of other stuff in the tomb. This is an actual photo of the guy in the middle. And a close-up, his skull is up at the top. On each side of his skull, he had ear spools, 3 pairs of ear spools on either side of his head. You see there. Incidentally, there you see peanuts. He had a set of peanuts, just like the looted tomb. So there's one of the ear spools. It's about 4.5 inches in diameter. So get a sense of scale. Those little beads around the outside are soldered on. And this is from somewhere around 400, 450 AD. How do you solder on beads? I think you'd have a hard time doing it today. The blue is lapis lazuli, again from Chile. Here's another one. This is about 4.5 inches in diameter. So the little guy in the middle is about 3 inches high. The collar around his neck is on gold wire. How do you make gold wire? 450 AD. He's got an arete, a nose ornament. He's got ear spools. The blue, again, lapis lazuli. So we remove that stuff. We continue to dig down, and he has a bunch of stuff around his neck. There's 2 sets of aretes, or nose ornaments, that would have gone into the septum of his nose. Here's a National Geographic representation of the burial. It had lots and lots of stuff. It had over 450 separate objects. One of the things it had a lot of were beads. Now, beads have been found in many, many excavations, particularly Huaqueros have found lots of beads. Little kids will go out to looted cemeteries with screens and sift and find beads and then sell beads to tourists and say, this is a 1,000-year-old bead. But they found these things and they thought, well, maybe we can figure out what this was. And what they ended up doing was pasting glue on this and then putting cloth on top of that, letting it harden, and then pulling the cloth off. Again, these beads are probably 3/8 of an inch round with a tiny hole in the middle. They're either shell or stone. And that's what they look like reconstructed. These are collars, bead collars that would have gone around his head. There were 7 sets. And there's one with him with one of the sets of bead collars around his neck, his septum on his nose, his ear spools, etc. Notice also the rattle. They found the rattle. There you see some of the peanuts, but there's the rattle. And there's a little bit closer view. When Chris Donnan saw this, he was there when they reached at this level. He saw this and he said, I know what that is. This guy is individual A. We have now found Charlemagne or Jesus Christ or some other personage from history. This is the guy that we see on the presentation scene, individual A, because the individual A holds that rattle. There it is. And the hand there gives you a sense of scale. It is hollow. There are stones inside to make the rattle. and it's made of gold. This is what's called a back flap in Moche iconography in the scenes on the pots. High status people have something like this hanging off their back end. This is gold. Here it is after it has been cleaned up. It has the decapitator god as a rattle at the top of this particular one. So that was the excavation, the first excavation that they made in 87 and 88. By 89 and 90, they were excavating elsewhere. The excavation we've just seen was here at the top. The looted tomb was out in front. Now they were excavating in the back. And so we're going to excavate down and down. And ultimately, they hit another tomb. This one is older. It's lower down in the pyramid. It dates about 250 years earlier. But there is a back flap, like we just saw, and a series of the rattles, and a bunch of other things. I really love these items right there. They're about 6 or 7 inches in diameter, and they represent a spider on a spider web. So you're seeing a spider web there made with gold wire, with the junctions of the wire soldered together, but the spider's body is a human face. They're absolutely fantastic, absolutely wonderful. And I've had my nose within about 12 inches of these things, and you just can't figure out how in the world did they do these things. This is from about 250 AD. A little figure there with a headdress, and this guy is about 3 inches high. The staff there, the club or whatever it is removable. This is another one of the back flaps. They determined that the two tombs, the one they call the Lord of Sipan and then the Old Lord of Sipan, first of all, are related on the matrilineal side. Their mothers or grandmothers or great-grandmothers and so forth were in the same line, so they were a hereditary position. They were both individual A. So instead of thinking about individual A as Charlemagne or some other personages, then we should be thinking about them as a role that was played in the Moche society, like a pope. And the pope could be different people, humans, but the role of pope would continue over a long period of time. Looking at all the stuff that was looted, they figured out that the looted tomb was also individual A. And in later excavations, they ultimately have done 13 tombs here. They found B and D in our presentation scene. So this one, I think, is D, a warrior, and this was B, a high priest. Included in the burial, there was a llama. That's a sacrificed llama there. So we've got B and D as well as A here at the site of Sipan. So in the time that left, I'm going to talk about another site. Sipan is up at the very top of this map in the Lambayeque Oasis. We're going to go a little bit farther south, 2 valleys to the farther south, down to the Hecatepeque Valley, hopefully. And we're going to go to a site called San Jose de Moro. So right at the fair top of this would be Sipan. We're now going to go to the Hecatepeque Valley that's there in the center, and San Jose de Moro is about there. And again, this is the area that I've done a lot of work. I've lived in this valley, and my doctoral dissertation was on an irrigation canal that went from about right there to about right there, Intervalley Canal. Largest engineering project in the pre-Hispanic Western Hemisphere was this particular canal. So, town of San Jose de Moro now is a fairly large little town. It completely covers the area of the site. Here's a view. The site is this. These black things here are the modern houses, but there is an area there that is the archaeological site. This is a 1940s photograph. At that time, there was no buildings, there was no town here, but you can see a couple of wakas or pyramids in those mixed in with those trees. It's a site that goes actually a little after the Moche, goes up to about 800, maybe even 850 AD. It's in the Hecatepeque Valley. And it was excavated by Chris Donnan, initially with one of his graduate students, Luis Jaime Castillo. I first met Luis Jaime in 1983 while I was working partly with Chris at a site in the Hecatepeque Valley. And they ended up working together here after Luis Jaime got his PhD. And then Luis Jaime ran a field school for Peruvian students and international students for about 20 years at this particular site. So there's Luis Jaime and I about 2005. He's a professor at the Catholic University where I taught in the 80s. More recently, he was Vice Minister of Culture within one of the Peruvian governments. Notice the excavation there in the background. The thing that they did here was to have huge excavations. The standard unit was 10 meters by 10 meters, so that's about 32 feet by 32 feet. And they would try to do 2 or 3 every season. They used students that came in here from around the world. The rule now in Peru is that if you have a student from, say, the US working on a project, you have to have a matching Peruvian student. So his students from Lima came out here, and for every one of them there would be an international student who was paying for it, and that's how they had the money to do this project, was the fees that the international students would pay to participate. But they excavated huge areas, and they had to go down quite a bit of ways. This is a huge burial area. It's mainly a burial site. There are a couple little pyramids. There's very little evidence of it as a residential site, but huge excavations. This is a Moche burial that was excavated in '98. This one has a number of burials in it. You can see one there, and there's one here. There would have been one there, a couple up there, some over here. Sometimes they were finding as many as 30 or 40 burials within one large excavation area. Here's a tomb that Donnan and Castillo excavated together in 1991. And the main person here was a female, 30 to 40 years old, buried in a cane coffin, and she had some significant things that they spotted. Notice the decoration up there at the top. Her body is right in here, but up there is a decoration, and that is the same decoration that we see individual C wearing in the presentation scene. On individual C, she always has this kind of funny hat or thing that looks like she's a court jester in medieval Europe. And she always has that, and she has it on there up at the top. There are 5 other females in this particular tomb. This is the excavation of that tomb. And among the things that they found there, notice that goblet. That's in the excavation, as it hasn't been removed yet. Look in the presentation scene and see that cup. Also notice that strange thing that's on her headdress. Shows up in the presentation scene images. Sometimes she's shown alone, sometimes she's with some of the other people, but it has this funny headdress thing right there. So these are some of the things that were found in that tomb. Little face thing, piece of pottery, and there's our goblet, our cup. Individual C holds a cup identical to that. Here's another high-status female, 1992. And because it's hard to see, I show the drawing there. The main person is in a cane coffin. There are several other people. There's actually 6 other burials in this one. But you can see the actual image there in the background. But it's a young girl, 5 to 7 years old, high-status female. And there's 6 other females, 6 other people, 2 boys and 4 female in this particular burial. And this is the same one. Notice that thing right there that is one of these funny headdress things that the individual C wears. So this is the third high status priestess found at San Jose de Moro. There's how those pictures were done. Donnan out on a ladder over the tomb. Today you'd use a drone, but this is in the 90s. And this is one, notice the thing right there. That's that funny head ornament on this person, another female. And there's one right there at the upper right. Total of 7 tombs have been found at this site of individual C. They did not have A, B, or D, but they have individual C for some reason. And they range over a period of almost 4 centuries, from the middle 300s to after the Moche period has pretty much ended. Moche ends around 700, but there's at least one of the high-status females, individual C, dates from after the decline of the Moche. So whatever this ceremony is that we're seeing in the presentation scene, it continued after Moche times. Show you one last image, and this is a little bit later, 2010, when they were just about wrapping up things at Morro. That's Luis Jaime that's got his back to us, and me there, and a Peruvian television crew. Luis Jaime had gotten a television program on Peruvian archaeology. Came out every 2 weeks with a new 30-minute program, and we were doing a program there on my work on Peruvian ancient irrigation. So that was the 2 of us there. Luis Jaime has actually been a house guest of us in California and has given lectures at my university. So we're just about out of time, and I'm always trying to get this in right on time. I have one more lecture to do tomorrow, and I don't know when, but morning or afternoon, I'm going to talk about Machu Picchu. So one more lecture to come. Thanks a lot. What? Here's our Moche pottery, but they don't do this on the pots. Oops. These are actual pots. There are pots with these figures on them. They're mainly in a museum in Brussels. But here's our little warriors. And these, again, are scenes that we have in these Moche pots. There's our background of the desert plants and hills. When we see sacrificial victims in some of the sites, they don't appear to be local. You can tell local by looking at their teeth and seeing the minerals in the teeth and see if they're from local water or from a little ways away. But they're not from, say, the mountains or from the eastern lowlands. They are coastal people. And these guys are going to fight. And one guy is going to lose. So he's going to lose his helmet, and he's going to lose his ear spools and his weapons. And then he's going to be marched away. We have scenes on wall murals of naked prisoners being marched away under guard. because his arete was taken from his septum, so he's bleeding, his nose is bleeding. So these guys are being taken away. And they're playing our music for us. So they're marching them along. These are vultures. They know it's soon to be dinner time. And here's our captured warriors. In some burials, they are disarticulated bodies, and there their throat is being cut, and a goblet is being filled. And that's individual C with her fancy headdress carrying the goblet. She hands it over. She marches past individual D, the warrior, and hands it to individual B, a high priest, and he takes it to individual A, who is seated in a little building. And that's our animated version of the presentation scene. All right, Machu Picchu tomorrow.